welcome back. Nalini and I had some great time off, and we are ready to hit 2025 with one of, I think, the biggest topics that I get asked the most, the one that people have the most misconceptions about, and that is, where does security compliance stop? And where does privacy compliance start? And I get all sorts of complaints about this space, and I think we can clear it up. This is going to be an easy, focused explanation that you can send to your general counsel. You can send to your CIO as a refresher. Here goes. Okay, so Nalini, there are, I'm gonna pretend to be some of my favorite clients. I have heard about CCPA. I have heard about GDPR. I have heard about some things from China, and I have heard about ISO 27000 and their privacy subset and SOC 2s, and it seems like an alphabet soup of overlapping requirements, and you got to be a priest. Like you have to understand the holy writs, deeply involved in and deeply focused on interpreting all these things in order to make head or tail of what you actually have to do. And what you actually have to do seems pretty subjective depending on the auditor or the prep person you talk to. Can you help untangle this web?
Well, let's go back to, how do frameworks and statutes and regulations get created in the first place? It's generally in response, dare I say, reaction to bad things, right? Or things that are deemed to require some kind of attention or protection. So good intentions there. For a long time, the focus in businesses and the digital realm in general is on security, right? Let's think about security as a form of protection. You're protecting assets, protecting company property, right? Whether that's data itself, which we'll get to because that's a key overlapping component with privacy, but it's physical assets, it's facilities, it's people, right? And what you're protecting them against are unauthorized access, threats, and so on. Data breaches are something that is both a security issue as well as a privacy issue, because if we think about privacy and data privacy, and let's narrow it down to the United States because data privacy is very culture bound. Now we're talking about ensuring the proper handling of personal information, right? Something that's about a natural person that you can identify about them throughout all the things that you do with it, right? It's called a life cycle. So from collection to deletion and destruction. And in the United States anyway, it's very consumer-based or patient-based, in the alphabet soup of regulations. And it focuses on rights of individuals in relation to their personal information, obligations of transparency, and what actually constitutes lawful data processing. So let me stop there.
Okay. I'm going to say it back to you like I'm 5.
Okay.
Because this is hard.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So security is about protecting the company and the company's assets from theft and crime. And privacy is about protecting consumers
mm-hmm. In
from
most cases, right.
wrongness.
Mm-hmm.
And in the US, the government has a large role in protecting consumers against the more uh, the more leveraged, the more resourced companies, big companies, from a unfair power dynamic, at least. That's the intent of a lot of this legislation.
Mm-hmm. And the genesis was around that power imbalance, specifically to data brokers. If you think about California, and to some extent with Colorado's state law, and the emphasis being on commercial enterprise, right? There are also a series of privacy rights and protections relative to individuals and government agencies, which takes more of the scope than we have today.
Sure. And a data breach is bad for the company, but it's
Yep.
also bad for the people whose information got lost because other bad people can do bad
Mm-hmm.
things to them with
Right. If the data
that
breach
kind of.
involves personal data, if it's
Mhm.
intellectual property of the company, right, it's just as bad for the company, but doesn't affect individuals. Right.
Sure. So it very much. So we got two overlapping circles. Your classic Venn diagram, and it really depends on what an organization loses.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Perfect. Tell us how. Tell us the conventional way of standing up a data security and compliance program, and how does that differ? How does the compliance side work? How does the security side work? What are their goals?
Yeah, big sigh. So, there's a range of possibilities. So, the first thing is, are you in a regulated sector or not? So, financial services, healthcare have more stringent requirements imposed upon them by state and federal uh, regulating bodies. Given that, what's your risk tolerance is a factor. And the conventional way is to say, okay, we're going to adopt a framework and we're going to prove our compliance by following the dimensions of that framework, which is typically a series of controls. It's a good start. However, businesses are not in the business of being compliant. They're in the business of providing a good or service or set of things. And they should be instead adopting really good data lifecycle practices, data protection practices that then naturally lead to compliance with a particular framework.
Mm-hmm.
So once the adoption of a framework comes, they start to do things like buy software for monitoring, do training programs, do practices like access control, right, in the security realm. The equivalent in privacy would be to create a data inventory, often from information assets from a security exercise. In privacy, you do impact assessments. You have to let people know when they ask what data you have about them.
Mm-hmm.
So you set that up programmatically. Then you say, oh, it would be really nice to have an attestation or a certification. So then you hire an implementation company to do that, or you do it yourself. And then you have to get audited. So you hire auditors. And what an auditor looks for is, to what extent are you doing what you claimed you were doing in your information security management system according to your controls? So again, it's necessary, it's a good start, but it's not an end of it within itself. And many companies can say, well, we've got these controls in place and their security sucks. Their privacy management can suck, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it all goes back to what's your risk tolerance, your security stance, What are your threat vectors? What's your privacy stance? Do you actually care, or do you want to do the bare minimum, right?
Mhm.
All of these are valid stances. I'm not going to comment. People who follow me know that I'm a privacy advocate. But those are the things that typically go into compliance. And it's an unfortunate term because compliance has a negative connotation around obedience and acquiescence. And instead, it's like, I want to change the conversation to how can we be more compatible? How can we be more congruent with the values that we espouse as a company? That's for the good of our
Mhm.
investors, our
Mhm.
stakeholders. That's also for the good of, being stakeholders means employees. So
Right.
to date, it's mainly the California law that leads with employees are also granted data rights for privacy,
Mhm.
uh, which is another overlap because you want to secure employee data. It tends to be sensitive for other reasons, right? If we
Sure.
trace it
Yeah.
back to security.
You and I talked about that back in our last one. No,
Mhm.
October, I think.
Times ago.
Yeah, where getting a fraudulent tax return filed with within your name was that's one of the top 3 risks for ordinary consumers, and that comes directly, usually, from your employer losing your information so that
Right.
someone can file your. They have your W-2. They stole it from your employer,
Mhm.
and they're going to get money out of you and cause you substantial pain with the federal government, hours on the phone with the IRS, because of your company's failure.
Right. So let's get concrete because I know I meandered a bit. So if we're looking at audit approaches, which
Mm-hmm.
if you're going to go down this route, following through with periodic audits, I think is really critical. So security audits typically they test the technical controls, right? Do you have proper access controls for your systems, for different data within your databases, etc.?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, they review system configurations. They look at incident response capabilities. They verify things like patch management for applications, pen
Mm-hmm.
test results, and that sort of stuff. Privacy audits, in contrast, are looking at data handling practices. So things like, gosh, you say that you have a data subject access request process. Let's see it. Are you within the 45-day limit of the law? If you need more time, have you notified the data subject of that? Where's the evidence, right? The
Mm-hmm.
emails or the logs. Third-party data sharing, what are you doing? How do you have protections around that? Contractual protections as well as data handling procedures. And then to some extent, a lawful basis uh, checking. In the United States, it's rather weak because it's either consent or that's about it,
Yeah.
as opposed to other jurisdictions where there are other legal bases, contract, legitimate interest, public vital interest, and so on. So those are a couple things. In
Can
terms
I
of, go
can I
ahead.
feed it back to you?
Sure.
Okay. Security compliance is big, and it's
Hmm.
technical, and it's designed because you're worried about damage to the company.
Hmm.
You're worried about, you want to see evidence that the different parts of the company, the different departments, are protecting themselves against crime,
Right. And
against
there's overlap, right, which we can
Mhm.
talk about in a moment. Hmm.
Yeah. And there's a and for privacy compliance, you are checking, you're worried a little bit more about the company's intentions, not are they protecting themselves, are they organized well, are they governed well, but
Hmm.
are they doing what they're supposed to? So you get a lot more questions about, yeah, but how are you using the data? What are you doing with it?
Right. Why are
Where
you collecting it in the first place? Do you have legitimate reason to do that? Mhm.
yeah,
Exactly.
one big misconception I see, a lot of a lot more people, I think, the doers and builders at a company get exposed to security compliance because it needs so much evidence. And then when they get in front of a privacy compliance review, they
Mhm.
try to like establish trust with this vomit of like, oh, we do this and this and this and this and this and this and this. And this privacy compliance people don't care.
Mhm.
And they say, well, but what are you doing with the data? Why do you have this many records? How many records do you have? How old are they?
Yeah, are you retaining it only for the time that you say you're supposed to be retaining it?
Right.
Are you encrypting it?
Yeah. And there's the overlap. But
Mhm.
often I notice when asked these questions, a lot of people who are used to the security side have kind of a I don't know. People do whatever they want as long as they have
Mhm.
access.
Mhm.
And it's a
And,
mind
there's
shift
no
for
law against it, so why don't we keep it, right? There's
yeah.
also the bias of we might need it one day, so we're gonna hang on to it, which is actually, I think, a risk and a liability for many companies.
Yeah,
The
increasingly so.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
So if you have I would say the big overlap that I know is third party due diligence.
Yep.
And that's where a lot of these get all mixed together
Mhm.
because some company, one of your customers, has compliance evidence requirements. Someone is making them verify that their vendors are up to snuff and not misusing the data. And they
Mhm.
also have security compliance
Mhm.
requirements where they want to make sure their vendors are adequately protecting these secrets so they will not be damaged. They
Right.
are at reasonable risk of their
Mhm.
secrets being stolen.
Mhm. And they're looking for certainty in areas where it's inherently, uh, shakier ground, in my view.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So when working with like a due diligence auditor, which is I think most people's experience with
Mhm.
security or compliance frameworks, it gets handed to them by a customer.
Right.
It's often mushed up again. How how what's a good strategy to respond? How
The
do you go
key
about it?
is not to have it only in your finance operations or only in your security office, right? To have a couple of steps where you're evaluating the type, the nature of the data, and to think up front about the inherent risks to individuals, not just to the company. Um, a little bit of forethought can go a long, long way in due diligence.
Yeah.
Then you need to make sure that there's congruence with your contracts and your data privacy or data protection addendum, right?
Mhm.
Uh, since we're talking about third parties, here's what we've authorized you to actually collect in terms of data. These are the mechanisms for collection. Here we can learn a lot from the EU, GDPR. Um,
Mhm.
and here's the basis for it. Here's how long we're going to retain it. And here are the systems it's going to be part of so that when you get an individual wanting to know what information you have about me, you've got a very straightforward mechanism to say, here it is. So in sum, it's about getting each of the key business unit players within your organization on board for the initial due diligence. And you also say, does this require a deep dive? Is it super sensitive data? Is it confidential data? Is it an email address and a first
Mhm.
name. Those require different levels of due diligence,
Sure.
right? So looking first at the data and then the systems and the system
Sure.
controls would be the approach I would generally recommend.
Yeah. One thing I have noticed is that you never get the owner of the company of your customer given you grief about these regulatory requirements or these security requirements. They're not
Mhm.
doing the third party review. That gets
Right.
outsourced or it gets dumped on
Mhm.
some poor person with a checklist, right? And
Mhm.
these people are often kind of at the very end of the tail. That they get whipped around.
Yep, that's the challenge. And it's given short
Mhm.
shrift at the beginning.
It,
Mhm.
and I have noticed that humanizing them, recognizing um, their agency, respecting them can go a long way because this is a difficult job, uh,
Mhm.
and helping them look good to their bosses can really go a long way. Saying, "I hear you. I think this question is speaking to a security
Mhm.
requirement. Here's our
Mhm.
narrative," as you say, like this is what we expect of ourselves about security. We're going to
Mhm.
give you more on this question than you ever dreamed. This question seems to be about privacy and specifically, I don't know, maybe you
Mhm.
cite the law. This is only like a Google away, right?
Mhm.
And you can say this is why we're not in scope, or maybe this is our process. This is how we use the data and how we don't, and how we make sure that that's true. And when you come with prepared answers, you know what's underneath, what the questions that they're just reading off a script. That can be a
Right.
really
And
powerful way to build trust with those auditors, those risk analysts.
it can. Yeah, and companies have been collecting they've been doing a few things, leading companies. Having answer
Mhm.
banks, right? Because some of these questions are repetitive, particularly if they're in B2B to enterprise customers. And there are a number of software products out there that help with that as well. So that's number one. Um, the second thing is actually writing up, in essence, a manifesto. So not just relying on the individual control answers, but saying, here's where we stand. I keep coming back to a couple of companies, like 37 Signals has got this right. They have a customer bill of rights. Um, they're extremely transparent. They keep things updated. I wish everyone operated that way. Um, those are both good trust
Mhm.
building, as you pointed out, efforts. And sadly, gosh, we could go on all day.
Yeah.
We want to make this tight for the folks who are listening in, and I hope that we'll get some questions and we
Mhm.
can tackle some things in a follow-up session
Yeah.
together.
I like where you landed. This is about building trust. The whole point of compliance is
Mhm.
building trust in a complicated space. Um, so, folks, if you have questions, please hit us up. We would love to talk to you about this mess. It's changing every quarter. New states are passing laws, new countries are passing laws, and the security landscape is changing. Um, Nalini?
Yep, interesting litigation. Yeah, the whole realm of AI as being an area of fascination, um, and a lot of, I think, knee-jerk reaction without sufficient understanding.
Mhm.
So perhaps we can tackle that in a future
Yep.
session. So thanks for having me
Yep.
again,
This has
Dylan.
been fun. folks, hit us up, ask the questions. Have a wonderful week.